Some moments change everything, and for little Emma that moment came when she could no longer trust the world around her. At just 7 years old, she had learned that not all adults keep children safe, and that sometimes the scariest-looking person can have the gentlest heart. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, mountain man Samuel Cray was known for his rough exterior and solitary ways. But when Emma ran to him with tears streaming down her face, something inside this hardened man softened. She pressed herself against his back, small hands gripping his coat, finding safety in his shadow. The townspeople stared as Samuel became her shield, wondering what terrible thing had driven this child to seek protection from a stranger. What had Emma seen that filled her with such fear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1882 had settled over Cedar Ridge like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of daily life beneath layers of snow and ice. Samuel Cray emerged from Hendrick's General Store with his weekly supplies, coffee, beans, salt pork, and ammunition, the same routine he had followed for the past 5 years. The townspeople gave him a respectful distance as he loaded his pack mule, their eyes following his movements with a mixture of wariness and grudging admiration. Samuel stood 6 feet 4 inches in his weathered boots, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and hands scarred from years of hard living. His beard, streaked with premature gray, covered most of his face, but couldn't hide the deep lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of too much seen and too much carried alone. Those who bothered to look closely might notice something unexpected in those dark eyes, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing frame. "Morning, Samuel." Doc Patterson tipped his hat as he approached, his medical bag clutched against his chest. The doctor was one of the few townspeople who regularly spoke to the mountain man, perhaps because his profession had taught him to see past surface appearances. "Doc." Samuel's voice was gravelly from disuse, a sound like stones grinding together. He secured the last of his supplies with practiced efficiency. "Heading back up to your place?" Samuel nodded toward the towering peaks that surrounded Cedar Ridge like sleeping giants. His cabin sat nestled in a valley 12 miles from town, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through thick stands of pine and aspen. It was a place where a man could disappear from the world, which was exactly what Samuel had intended when he'd built it with his own hands. "Heard tell there might be more snow coming," Doc Patterson continued, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air.
"You got enough supplies to last?"
"I'll manage." Samuel's responses were always brief, not from rudeness, but from years of solitude. Words had become precious things to him, not to be wasted on idle conversation. As Samuel prepared to leave, his attention was drawn to a commotion near the church. Reverend Mills was speaking in hushed tones with Mayor Caldwell and Sheriff Thompson, their faces grave with concern. Samuel had learned long ago to pay attention to such gatherings. They often meant trouble was brewing. "Something's got them all worked up," Doc Patterson observed, following Samuel's gaze. Before Samuel could respond, a small figure darted between the buildings, moving with the desperate speed of a frightened animal. The child, for that's what it was, Samuel realized, stumbled in the deep snow, fell, scrambled back to her feet, and continued running. Her dress was torn and stained, her dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face, and she was running straight toward him. Samuel stood perfectly still as the little girl reached him, her small hands grasping at his thick wool coat. She pressed herself against his back, trembling not just from the cold, but from terror so profound it seemed to radiate from her tiny frame. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps that created small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. "Well, I'll be," Doc Patterson whispered. The child couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with huge dark eyes that darted constantly, searching for threats that only she could see. Her clothes, while quality made, were dirty and torn. More concerning were the smudges on her face that looked suspiciously like soot, and the way she flinched at every sound, every movement. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a stirring of protective instinct he thought he'd buried years ago. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head to look down at the girl. She met his gaze for just a moment before pressing her face against his coat again. But in that brief connection, he saw a depth of fear and loss that no child should ever carry. "Hey there, little one," he said, his voice softer than anyone in Cedar Ridge had ever heard it. "You're safe now." By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of half the town. Reverend Mills hurried over, his black coat flapping behind him like the wings of a great bird. Sheriff Thompson followed, his hand resting on his gun belt, a habit more than a threat. "Samuel, thank the Lord," Reverend Mills panted as he reached them. "We've been looking everywhere for her." "She yours?" Samuel asked, though he could tell from the Reverend's manner that she wasn't. No. She just appeared this morning. Wouldn't say a word to anyone. Mrs. Henderson tried to coax her into the boarding house for some warm food. But the child just ran off. The Reverend's kind face was creased with worry. "We don't even know her name." Sheriff Thompson stepped closer, his weathered features showing genuine concern. "Found tracks leading into town from the East Road, but they're mostly covered by the new snow. Looks like she's been walking for miles." Samuel felt the child's grip tighten on his coat. Her whole body was shaking now, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "Probably both. What's your name, sweetheart?" Doc Patterson asked gently, crouching down to the child's level. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd spoken. Her face remained buried against Samuel's back as if she could disappear into the safety he provided. "She hasn't spoken a word since she got here," Reverend Mills explained. "Just kept running from anyone who tried to approach her until," he gestured at the scene before them, "until she found Samuel," Sheriff Thompson finished, his tone puzzled. "Strange thing, a child seeking comfort from—" He caught himself before finishing the thought, but everyone present knew what he'd been about to say. "From the most feared man in the territory." Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross, no bigger than his thumb. It was smooth from handling, carved from a piece of pine with infinite patience during long winter nights. Without thinking about it, he held it where the child could see it. She lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes focusing on the simple carving. For a moment, the fear in her expression lessened, replaced by something like wonder. "Did you make that?" she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. The men around them exchanged glances. These were the first words she'd spoken since arriving in Cedar Ridge. "Yes," Samuel replied simply. "Would you like to hold it?" She nodded, and Samuel gently placed the cross in her small palm. Her fingers closed around it protectively, and for the first time since she'd appeared in their town, some of the tension left her small shoulders. "Can you tell us your name?" Reverend Mills asked again, his voice gentle and encouraging. The child looked up at Samuel as if seeking permission. He nodded slightly. "Emma," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name," Doc Patterson said. "Emma, can you tell us where you came from? Where are your folks?" At this question, the fear returned to her eyes tenfold. She shook her head violently and pressed herself against Samuel again, as if trying to make herself disappear. "Easy now," Samuel murmured. "Nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do." The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur among themselves. Samuel could hear fragments of their conversations, speculation about where she'd come from, what might have happened to her family, what they should do with her. The sound seemed to agitate Emma, and her trembling increased. "That's enough," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The murmuring stopped instantly. The child's been through enough without having to listen to everyone's theories. He looked down at Emma, who was still clutching his cross. "You hungry?" She nodded hesitantly. "Mrs. Henderson's got hot stew and fresh bread," Reverend Mills offered. "The boarding house is warm," and Emma shook her head frantically, her grip on Samuel's coat tightening. Samuel studied the child's face, seeing the desperation there. Whatever had happened to her had shattered her ability to trust anyone except, for reasons he couldn't fathom, him. "Tell you what," he said finally. "Why don't you come with me for now? I've got a warm cabin and plenty of food. When you're ready to talk about what happened, we will. Until then, you're safe. Samuel," Sheriff Thompson said quietly. "You sure about this? Taking care of a child is a big responsibility." Samuel looked down at Emma, who was watching him with desperate hope in her dark eyes. In her small face, he saw echoes of another child, one he'd failed to protect long ago. The old wound in his chest, never fully healed, gave a familiar ache. "I'm sure," he said. Doc Patterson stepped forward. "At least let me take a look at her, make sure she's not hurt." Emma looked questioningly at Samuel, who nodded. "Doc's a good man. He just wants to make sure you're okay." With gentle hands, Doc Patterson examined the child while she stayed close to Samuel's side. Apart from exhaustion, cold, and what appeared to be soot stains on her clothes and skin, she seemed physically unharmed. "She needs a warm bath, hot food, and rest," the doctor concluded. "But she's strong. Whatever she's been through, she's a survivor." Samuel gathered his supplies and prepared to leave town with his unexpected charge. As they walked toward his pack mule, Emma staying close by his side, he couldn't help but notice how the townspeople watched them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Samuel," Reverend Mills called out, "if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." Samuel nodded his thanks. As they reached the edge of town, Emma looked back once at Cedar Ridge, her expression unreadable. Then she turned toward the mountains, her small hand finding its way into Samuel's large, scarred one. The journey to Samuel's cabin would take the better part of the day, especially traveling with a child. But as they began the winding trail into the wilderness, Samuel found himself walking slower than usual, matching his pace to Emma's shorter steps. The cross he'd given her remained clutched tightly in her free hand, and occasionally she would look up at him with something that might have been the beginning of trust. Neither of them spoke during the first hour of their journey, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. Samuel had always been a man of few words, and Emma seemed to understand that actions mattered more than promises. By choosing to walk beside him toward an uncertain future, she was placing her faith in a stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness. As the trail wound higher into the mountains, Samuel found himself wondering what had brought this frightened child to his doorstep. But he also knew that some stories could only be told when the teller was ready. Until then, he would do what he'd always done best. He would stand between the innocent and whatever darkness threatened them, no matter the cost. The cabin Samuel had built sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the mountain wind. Smoke curled from the stone chimney and warm light glowed through the single window, creating a beacon of comfort in the wilderness. Emma had walked the entire 12-mile journey without complaint, though Samuel could see exhaustion in every line of her small body. Inside, the cabin was simple but well built. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened from years of use. Samuel's few possessions were arranged with military precision: a small table and 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies, and a narrow bed in the corner. It was a place built for solitude, not for housing a frightened child. Emma stood just inside the door, still clutching the wooden cross, her dark eyes taking in every detail of her new surroundings. Samuel busied himself building up the fire and putting water onto heat, giving her time to adjust. "Are you hungry?" he asked, not turning from his work at the stove. She nodded, settling herself on the floor near the fireplace where the warmth could reach her. Samuel prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, watching from the corner of his eye as Emma gradually relaxed in the cabin's warmth. It was only after she'd eaten and he'd wrapped her in one of his spare blankets that she finally spoke again. "They burned it all," she whispered. So quietly, Samuel almost missed the words. He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "What burned, Emma?" Her small hands twisted in the blanket, and when she looked up at him, tears were streaming down her face. "Our house, the barn, everything." Samuel waited, sensing that pushing would only cause her to retreat back into silence. Sometimes the hardest stories came out slowly, like water from a deep well. "Mama and Papa were inside," she continued, her voice breaking. They couldn't get out. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd suspected tragedy, but hearing it confirmed in such a small, broken voice made something twist painfully in his chest. "I'm sorry, little one," he said softly. "I'm so very sorry." Emma reached into the folds of her torn dress and pulled out something small and blackened, a photograph, half burned and barely recognizable. But Samuel could make out the faces. A man and woman standing beside a young girl who was unmistakably Emma. The edges were charred, and soot stains obscured parts of the image. But the love in the family's faces was still visible. "This is all I have left of them," she said, holding the damaged photograph as if it were made of the finest glass. Samuel studied the artifact she'd saved, understanding instinctively that it represented far more than just a picture. It was proof that love had existed, that Emma had once been part of something whole and safe. "They're beautiful," he said simply. "Tell me about them." For the next hour, Emma spoke in halting words about her parents. Her father had been a rancher, working a spread about 30 miles east of Cedar Ridge. Her mother had taught her to read and write, and had been teaching her to play the piano they'd bought in Denver. It had been a good life, full of the simple pleasures that made a house into a home. "Papa was teaching me to ride," Emma said, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. "He said I was getting so good I'd be ready for roundup next spring." Samuel listened to every word, filing away details that might matter later. But he also heard what she wasn't saying, the gaps in her story, the way she avoided talking about the night of the fire itself. As the evening wore on, Emma's eyelids grew heavy, but every time she began to doze, she would jerk awake with a gasp, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for threats. "I can't sleep," she whispered after the 4th time this happened. "Every time I close my eyes, I see—" She stopped, shaking her head. "See what, Emma?" She was quiet for so long, Samuel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she had to say them quickly or lose her courage entirely. "It wasn't an accident," she said. "The fire, I mean. There were men there, bad men. They came to our house after dark, and Papa told me to hide in the root cellar. He said no matter what I heard, I wasn't to come out until morning." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. "What did you hear?" "Shouting. Papa was angry, angrier than I'd ever heard him. He was telling them to get off our land, that he'd already talked to the sheriff about their cattle." Emma's voice grew smaller. "Then there were gunshots." The picture was becoming clearer, and Samuel didn't like what he was seeing. Cattle rustlers, most likely, who'd been using Emma's family's land to move stolen stock. Her father had discovered them and threatened to expose their operation. What happened next? "I heard Mama screaming, and then I smelled smoke. I wanted to go help them, but Papa had made me promise to stay hidden. By the time I came out, the whole house was burning." Emma's tears came harder now. "I tried to get to them, but the fire was too big, too hot. I couldn't save them." Samuel moved from his chair to sit beside her on the floor, his large frame folding down with surprising grace. "Emma, look at me." She raised her tear-stained face to meet his eyes. "What happened to your parents was not your fault. You were a little girl, and your papa knew what he was doing when he told you to hide. He saved your life, but I should have helped them." "No," Samuel said firmly. "You did exactly what you should have done. You survived, and that's what they would have wanted." Emma considered this, then continued her story. "After the fire died down, I heard the men talking. They were worried because they couldn't find me. One of them said they had to make sure there were no witnesses." Samuel's jaw tightened. These weren't just cattle rustlers. They were murderers who'd killed to protect their secret. And now they were hunting a 7-year-old child to silence her forever. I hid until they left, then I started walking. I didn't know where to go, so I just followed the road. I walked for 3 days, hiding when I heard horses coming, eating berries and drinking from streams. Emma looked down at her torn dress and dirty hands. "I was so scared they'd find me. Did you get a good look at any of these men?" Emma nodded slowly. 3 of them. One had a scar on his face right here. She traced a line down her left cheek. Another one was real tall and thin, like a scarecrow. The 3rd one was the leader, I think. He wore a big hat and had a gold tooth that caught the firelight when he smiled. Samuel committed every detail to memory. Somewhere out there, 3 murderers were still looking for the only witness to their crimes. They'd killed Emma's parents in cold blood, burned down their home. And now they wanted to finish what they'd started. "Emma," he said carefully, "these men, do you think they followed you to Cedar Ridge?" Her eyes went wide with terror. "I don't know. I tried to be careful, but what if they did? What if they hurt people because of me?" "Nobody's going to get hurt," Samuel said with quiet conviction. "I won't let that happen." Looking at the charred photograph in Emma's hands, Samuel made a silent promise to the faces smiling back at him. Their daughter had suffered enough. Whatever it took, however dangerous it became, he would keep her safe. But even as he made this vow, Samuel knew that the peaceful isolation he'd built for himself was about to end. 3 killers were somewhere out there in the darkness, and they wouldn't stop until they found Emma. The only question was whether Samuel would be ready for them when they came. Emma finally fell asleep curled up on the rug before the fire. The burned photograph clutched against her heart, and the wooden cross still gripped in her other hand. Samuel sat watching over her through the long night, his mind already planning for the battle he knew was coming. The mountain winds howled around the cabin, but inside, a frightened child slept under the protection of a man who'd forgotten how to be anything but her guardian. Neither of them knew that their enemies were already closer than they imagined. Following a trail that would lead straight to Samuel's door, Samuel woke before dawn, as was his habit. But for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Emma lay curled beneath his spare blanket, near the dying embers of the fire, her dark hair spread across the makeshift pillow he'd fashioned from his own coat. Even in sleep, her small hand maintained its grip on the wooden cross, and the burned photograph lay carefully tucked beneath her cheek, moving with practiced silence. Samuel built up the fire and started coffee brewing. The familiar routine felt different now, expanded to include another person's needs. He found himself considering what a child might want for breakfast, realizing how little he knew about caring for someone so young and vulnerable. Emma stirred as the aroma of coffee and frying bacon filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, her eyes immediately scanning the room, before settling on Samuel's reassuring presence at the stove. "Morning," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning, little one. Sleep well?" She nodded. Though Samuel had heard her whimpering during the night, caught in the grip of nightmares he couldn't chase away. They would take time to heal, if they ever did completely. After breakfast, Samuel began the process of making his cabin more suitable for a child's needs. He cleared out a corner near the window, fashioning a small sleeping area with extra blankets and a pillow stuffed with pine needles. Emma watched his preparations with quiet attention, saying little but missing nothing. "This will be your space," he told her, smoothing the blankets. "You can keep your things here, and it'll be private when you need it to be." As he worked, Samuel found himself remembering skills he thought he'd forgotten. The careful attention to detail, the protective instincts, the patience required to care for someone smaller and more fragile than himself. These memories led him to a place he rarely visited, a wooden box tucked beneath his narrow bed. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the artifacts of his past life. His discharge papers from the Union Army, a daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and beneath everything else, a small brass military medal, tarnished with age, but still bearing the inscription, "For valor above and beyond the call of duty." Emma appeared beside him as he held the medal, drawn by curiosity despite her natural wariness. "What's that?" she asked. Samuel considered lying or deflecting, but something in her earnest expression made him choose honesty instead. "It's from the war. They gave it to me for doing my duty. Were you a soldier?" "Yes, a long time ago." Emma studied the medal with the serious attention children reserve for important things. "My papa said soldiers protect people who can't protect themselves." "Your papa was right." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Is that why you're helping me?" "Because you were a soldier." Samuel looked down at this small girl who'd lost everything, who'd walked for days through dangerous country to find safety, and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of old grief, perhaps, or the awakening of purposes he'd thought were buried forever. "I'm helping you because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. That afternoon, Samuel began teaching Emma basic skills she would need in their remote location. How to bank a fire so it would burn through the night. How to identify which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid. How to move quietly through the forest, stepping on stones and roots rather than dried leaves that would crackle underfoot. "Why do I need to know this?" she asked as he showed her how to find direction using the position of the sun. "Because knowledge makes you strong," Samuel replied. "The more you understand about the world around you, the safer you'll be." What he didn't tell her was that these were survival skills, the kind of knowledge that might keep her alive if something happened to him. The thought of leaving her unprotected made his stomach clench. But Samuel had learned long ago that hope for the best while preparing for the worst was the only way sensible people lived. Emma proved to be an eager student. Her young mind absorbed information quickly, and her natural curiosity drove her to ask thoughtful questions. Samuel found himself enjoying the role of teacher, rediscovering the satisfaction that came from passing on useful knowledge. As the days passed, Emma began to open up more about her life before the tragedy. She told him about helping her mother in the kitchen, about feeding chickens and gathering eggs, about the wildflowers she'd planted in a small garden behind their house. Samuel listened to every word, understanding that these memories were precious to her, proof that love and happiness had once existed in her world. But the trauma was never far from the surface. Loud noises made her jump. Unexpected movements caused her to freeze like a startled deer. And every night brought the same cycle of exhaustion, fitful sleep, and awakening with gasps and tears. It was on their fourth night together that Samuel's military training proved its worth. He woke instantly, his hand moving to the rifle beside his bed before he was fully conscious. Something had disturbed the forest's natural rhythm, a sound that didn't belong, a presence that set his nerves on edge. Emma was sitting up in her makeshift bed, her eyes wide with terror. "Someone's out there," she whispered. Samuel nodded grimly. He'd heard it too, the soft crunch of snow underfoot, moving too carefully to be a wild animal. Someone was approaching his cabin, trying to stay quiet and failing because they didn't know the mountain the way Samuel did. "Get under the bed," he whispered to Emma. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." She scrambled to obey, clutching the burned photograph and his wooden cross. Samuel checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, then moved to the window. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the clearing and making the shadows deeper by contrast. 3 figures moved through the trees, approaching from different directions. They were trying to surround the cabin, but they were city men, unused to wilderness. Samuel could track their movements by the sounds they made. A boot scraping against bark, the whisper of cloth against a branch, the soft thud of snow falling from a disturbed pine bough. One of them was tall and thin, moving like a scarecrow in the wind. Another bore a scar down his left cheek that was visible even in the moonlight. The third wore a large hat and moved with the confidence of a leader. Emma's description had been perfect. The killers had found them. Samuel felt the familiar calm that had served him well during the war settle over him like a well-worn coat. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, and his mind began calculating angles, distances, and tactical advantages. These men had made a critical error. They'd brought a fight to a place where Samuel held every advantage. The mountain man was gone, replaced by the soldier he'd once been. And that soldier had never lost a battle when protecting the innocent was at stake. The 3 men circled Samuel's cabin like wolves testing the defenses of their prey. Samuel watched them through the window, noting their positions and predicting their next moves with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through countless battles. The tall one carried a rifle awkwardly, like a man more accustomed to intimidation than actual fighting. The scarred one moved with more confidence, his hand resting on a pistol at his hip. But it was the leader who concerned Samuel most. He advanced with the careful precision of someone who'd done this before. Samuel glanced toward his bed where Emma lay hidden, her breathing so quiet he had to strain to hear it. The burned photograph of her parents seemed to watch him from beneath the bed frame, their faces a silent reminder of what these men had already taken from this innocent child. The leader raised his hand, and his companions stopped their advance. Even from 50 yards away, Samuel could see the man's gold tooth glinting in the moonlight as he smiled. "The bastard was enjoying this. We know you're in there," the leader called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "We just want to talk." Samuel said nothing, keeping his rifle trained on the man's chest. These weren't the kind of people who came calling in the middle of the night for conversation. "You've got something that belongs to us," the man continued. "Something that wandered away from where it should be." The casual way he referred to Emma as a thing made Samuel's finger tighten on the trigger. But he forced himself to remain patient, to let them reveal their intentions fully before he acted. "Now we know you mountain folk like to keep to yourselves," the leader said, taking a step closer. "But this is bigger than that. This is business that needs settling." The scarred man had circled around to the left side of the cabin, while the tall one moved toward the right. They were trying to create crossfire positions, but they were doing it badly. Samuel had seen Confederates execute similar maneuvers with deadly efficiency during the war. These men were dangerous but sloppy. "Tell you what," the leader called out. "You send out what we're looking for, and we'll be on our way. Nobody needs to get hurt here." From beneath the bed came the faintest whisper, "Don't let them take me." The sound of Emma's terrified voice made something cold and final settle in Samuel's chest. These men had murdered her parents, burned her home, and driven her to walk for days through dangerous country just to survive. Now they wanted to finish what they'd started. That wasn't going to happen. Samuel had learned during his military service that sometimes violence was the only language evil men understood. He'd hoped those days were behind him, but some skills, once learned, were never truly forgotten. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside, his rifle held ready but not immediately threatening. The three men tensed but didn't draw their weapons. Yet, "Gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd used to command troops. "You're on my land and it's past midnight. State your business." The leader's gold tooth caught the light again as he smiled. "Just looking for a lost child. Little girl, about 7 years old. Dark hair? You seen anyone like that?" "Can't say that I have." "Now, that's interesting," the leader said, taking another step forward. "Because we tracked her right to this mountain, and your cabin's the only shelter for 20 miles. Tracks can be misleading," Samuel replied. "Easy to lose a trail in snow like this." The scarred man spoke for the first time, his voice rough as gravel. "Maybe we should take a look inside, just to be sure." Samuel's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, the rifle moving to a more ready position. "I don't think that's going to happen." The tension in the clearing ratcheted up another notch. Samuel could see the men's hands hovering near their weapons, their breathing creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. The moment was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move from any of them would turn the conversation deadly. "Look, friend," the leader said, his voice still reasonable, but with an edge creeping in. "We've come a long way, and we're not leaving empty-handed. That little girl saw something she shouldn't have, and now she needs to come with us. And what if I told you there's no child here?" The tall man laughed, a sound like grinding bones. "Then we'd know you were lying. We found her tracks leading right to your door." Samuel nodded slowly, as if considering their words. In reality, he was calculating distances and angles, preparing for what he knew was coming. "Well then," he said finally, "I guess we have a problem." The leader's hand dropped toward his gun, but Samuel had been expecting the move for the past 5 minutes. His rifle came up in one smooth motion, and the crack of gunfire echoed off the surrounding peaks. The leader spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Samuel was already moving, diving to his left as the scarred man drew his pistol. The shot went wide, splintering the wood frame of Samuel's door. Years of military training took over completely. Samuel rolled behind a pile of firewood he'd stacked beside the cabin, using it for cover as he worked the bolt of his rifle. The tall man was running toward him, trying to close the distance. But he was crossing open ground against an entrenched position. Samuel's second shot took him in the chest, dropping him into the snow where he lay still. The scarred man had taken cover behind a large pine tree, periodically leaning out to fire wild shots at Samuel's position. But Samuel had fought Apache warriors who could make every bullet count. This man's panicked shooting didn't worry him. What did concern him was Emma's safety. Every shot fired increased the chance that a stray bullet might find its way into the cabin where she lay hidden. Samuel low-crawled through the snow, circling around to get a better angle on the scarred man's position. The cold bit through his clothes, but he ignored it. He'd fought through worse conditions during the winter campaigns of '64. The scarred man made the mistake of exposing too much of himself while trying to get a clear shot. Samuel's rifle spoke again, and the man fell backward, his pistol spinning away into the snow. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the leader's labored breathing as he tried to crawl toward his fallen companions. Samuel emerged from cover, his rifle trained on the wounded man. "Should have taken no for an answer," Samuel said quietly. The leader looked up at him, gold tooth no longer glinting because his smile was gone. "You don't know what you're messing with, mountain man. There are more of us. Lots more. Then they'll find the same thing you did." Samuel bound the man's wounded arm, not out of mercy, but because he needed him alive long enough to answer questions. Like how many others were coming, and when. Inside the cabin, Emma emerged from beneath the bed, still clutching her mother's locket and Samuel's wooden cross. She looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and a new understanding of the violence that surrounded her young life. "Are they gone?" she whispered. Samuel nodded, though he knew this was only the beginning. The leader's words echoed in his mind. "There are more of us." Tonight's fight had been won, but the war was just getting started. Dawn came grey and cold over the mountain clearing, revealing the full extent of the previous night's violence. Samuel had spent the hours before sunrise dragging the bodies away from his cabin, not wanting Emma to see them in the harsh light of day. The wounded leader, bound and semi-conscious, lay propped against a tree where Samuel could watch him. Emma sat at the small table inside, carefully drawing on a piece of brown paper with a charcoal stick Samuel had fashioned for her. Her small tongue poked out in concentration as she worked, and Samuel was struck by how normal she looked, just a child engaged in a simple activity, as if the world hadn't tried to destroy her multiple times over. "What are you drawing?" he asked, pouring coffee into his tin cup. "Our ranch," she said without looking up, the way it was before. Samuel peered over her shoulder at the map taking shape under her careful hands. She was remarkably detailed for someone so young, marking not just the house and barn, but also the corrals, the well, the small garden her mother had tended, and even the old oak tree where her father had hung a rope swing. "You have a good memory," he observed. "Mama always said I was good at remembering important things." Emma paused in her work, looking up at him with serious eyes. "Will this help catch the bad men?" Samuel studied the map more carefully. Emma had marked not just the buildings, but also the surrounding terrain, the creek that ran behind the house, the hill where her father had kept watch over the cattle, the narrow canyon that led to the main trail. Most importantly, she'd indicated the line shack where the rustlers had been holding stolen cattle. "This helps a great deal," he said truthfully. The map revealed the tactical situation at Emma's family ranch, showing him exactly where the crimes had taken place and how the rustlers had been using the property. A groan from outside interrupted their conversation. The gang leader was coming around, probably driven to consciousness by pain from his wounded shoulder. Samuel checked his rifle and stepped outside, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could hear if Emma needed him. The man's gold tooth was broken now, chipped during his fall the night before. Blood had dried on his lips, and his face was pale from blood loss. But his eyes still held the cruel intelligence that had made him dangerous. "Morning," Samuel said conversationally, settling onto a stump where he could watch both the prisoner and the approaches to his cabin. "Go to hell," the man replied through gritted teeth. "Eventually, I imagine. But not today." Samuel sipped his coffee. What's your name? When the man didn't answer, Samuel continued, Doesn't matter much, I suppose. What does matter is how many more of you are coming, and when. The leader's laugh turned into a cough that brought up specks of blood. You think killing 3 of us ends this? We got 20 men in our outfit, and they'll come looking when we don't report back. Samuel had suspected as much. The operation large enough to require murdering witnesses wouldn't be run by just 3 men. When are they expecting you back? 3 days, the man said, then immediately looked like he wished he'd kept his mouth shut. That gives us some time, then. Samuel studied his prisoner. Tell me about your boss. I am the boss. Samuel shook his head. You're a lieutenant, maybe a trusted hand, but you're not running this show. Too eager to get your hands dirty, not smart enough to stay back and let others take the risks. The man's eyes narrowed with hatred, but he didn't contradict Samuel's assessment. So who is running things? And don't tell me you don't know. They wouldn't have sent you to clean up this mess if they didn't trust you with the important details. Before the man could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest. Samuel was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, but he relaxed when he recognized the voices calling out, Samuel! You in there? It was Sheriff Thompson, accompanied by Doc Patterson and 2 deputies Samuel didn't recognize. Here, Samuel called back, not moving from his position between the approaching riders and his cabin. The 4 men rode into the clearing, their faces grim. Sheriff Thompson's eyes took in the signs of battle, the disturbed snow, the dark stains that hadn't been there during his last visit. And the bound prisoner propped against the tree heard gunfire during the night, Thompson said, dismounting carefully. Thought we'd better check on you and the girl. We had visitors, Samuel replied simply. Doc Patterson was already examining the wounded gang leader, his medical instincts overriding any questions about who the man was or what he'd done. This man needs proper medical attention, Samuel. That shoulder wound could go septic if it's not cleaned and dressed properly. He'll live long enough to answer some questions. Sheriff Thompson studied the scene more carefully. 3 men came calling by the looks of it. Where are the other 2? Samuel nodded toward the tree line where he'd dragged the bodies. They won't be bothering anyone else. One of the deputies, a young man with nervous energy, started toward the trees to investigate, but Thompson stopped him with a gesture. Leave them be for now, Jenkins. We'll deal with that after we understand what happened here. Emma appeared in the doorway of the cabin, still holding her drawing. She looked at the newcomers with the wariness of a child who'd learned that not all adults could be trusted, but she didn't run or hide. Samuel took that as progress. Morning, Emma, Doc Patterson said gently. How are you feeling today? She looked to Samuel for permission before answering. I'm okay. Samuel takes good care of me. Sheriff Thompson crouched down to Emma's level, his weathered face kind but serious. Emma, these men who came here last night, were they the same ones who hurt your family? She nodded solemnly, then held up her drawing. I made a map of our ranch. Samuel said it might help. Thompson studied the map with growing interest. This is very good work, Emma. Very helpful indeed. The wounded gang leader spoke up from his position against the tree, his voice weak but still venomous. You're all making a big mistake. When our boys come looking for us, this whole mountain's going to burn. Is that a threat? Thompson asked mildly. It's a promise. Samuel exchanged a look with the sheriff. Both men understood the implications. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Sheriff, Samuel said quietly, we need to talk, privately. Thompson nodded and followed Samuel a few yards away from the others. Emma retreated into the cabin, but left the door open, clearly listening to every word. That map she drew, Samuel said, shows where they were running their operation. Lane shack about 2 miles from the main house, perfect for holding stolen cattle before moving them to market. How big an operation are we talking about? Big enough to kill for. And according to our friend over there, big enough to field 20 men when they come looking for revenge. Thompson removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. Samuel, I've got 4 deputies and a town full of people who can't defend themselves against that kind of force. We need to think about getting Emma somewhere safe. Maybe Denver or Colorado Springs until this blows over. Samuel looked back toward the cabin where Emma sat in the doorway. her young face set with determination despite everything she'd endured. "She's not going anywhere. This is where she feels safe, and moving her would just put other people at risk. Then what do you propose?" Samuel's expression hardened. "We end this. Before they can bring more men, before they can hurt anyone else. We take the fight to them." Thompson stared at him for a long moment. "Samuel, what you're talking about, that's war." "Sheriff," Samuel said quietly, "that's exactly what this is." That evening, after Sheriff Thompson and his men had departed with their prisoner, Samuel sat by the fire reading from his worn Bible. The leather cover was cracked with age, and pressed between its pages were dried wildflowers, mountain laurel, Indian paintbrush, and columbines that had once grown in a small garden tended by loving hands. Emma watched him with quiet curiosity as he turned the delicate pages. "My wife picked these," Samuel said softly, noticing her interest. "She said they were too beautiful to let fade away completely." Emma moved closer to the fire, settling beside him on the rough wooden floor. "What was her name?" "Margaret." "But I called her Maggie." Samuel's fingers traced the pressed petals of a columbine, its blue color still visible despite the years. "She would have liked you very much. What happened to her?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of old grief. Samuel closed the Bible carefully, holding it as if it contained something infinitely precious. "She died of fever the winter after I came back from the war. I'd been gone for 3 years, and she'd waited for me all that time. We only had 6 months together before—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Emma reached out and touched his hand with her small fingers. "I'm sorry. So am I, little one. So am I." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whisper through the pine boughs outside. Finally, Emma spoke again. "Is that why you live up here all by yourself? Because you miss her?" Samuel considered the question carefully. He'd never spoken of this to anyone, never tried to explain the choices that had led him to this isolated cabin in the mountains. "Partly," he admitted. "After Maggie died, I didn't see much point in being around other people. They reminded me of what I'd lost, but you helped me. You needed help. There's a difference." Emma studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the weathered exterior to the pain that still lived in his dark eyes. "You know what I think?" "What do you think?" "I think maybe God sent me to you because you needed someone to take care of. And I needed someone to take care of me." Samuel looked down at this wise little girl who'd lost everything, but somehow still believed in purpose and meaning. "You might be right about that." Over the following days, their routine settled into something that felt almost normal. Samuel taught Emma more wilderness skills, while she helped him with daily chores around the cabin. She proved surprisingly capable for someone so young, able to tend the fire, prepare simple meals, and even help Samuel with maintenance tasks that required smaller hands. But underneath the domestic tranquility, both of them remained aware that danger was coming. Samuel had begun preparing defensive positions around the cabin, creating concealed rifle pits and establishing clear fields of fire. Emma watched these preparations with the serious attention of someone who understood that her life might depend on such details. "When they come," she said one afternoon as Samuel checked his ammunition supply, "will there be a lot of them?" "Probably. Are you scared?" Samuel paused in his work, considering how to answer truthfully without frightening her more than necessary. "I'm concerned. Fear can be useful if it keeps you alert, but it becomes a problem if it keeps you from doing what needs to be done." Emma nodded gravely, processing this wisdom. "I'm scared," she admitted. "That's understandable. You've been through things no child should have to experience, but I'm not going to let being scared stop me from helping you." Samuel looked at this small, brave girl and felt his heart swell with pride and protectiveness. "Emma, when the fighting starts, your job is to stay safe. That's how you help me most, by not giving me something else to worry about. But what if?" "No what ifs," Samuel said firmly. "You hide, you stay quiet, and you let me handle the rest. Promise me." She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "I promise." That night, as they prepared for bed, Emma surprised him with a question that cut straight to the heart of something he'd been avoiding. "Samuel, After this is over, after the bad men are gone, what happens to me? He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. The truth was, he'd grown so accustomed to her presence that he couldn't imagine his cabin without her small voice, her careful questions, her quiet company by the fire. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. "I want to stay with you. If that's okay." Samuel felt something tight in his chest loosen, a knot of loneliness that had been there so long he'd forgotten it existed. "Emma, I'd like that very much. But there might be people who think a little girl needs more than an old mountain man can provide." "Like what?" "School, other children to play with, a woman's influence as you grow up." Emma considered this seriously. "Could we visit town sometimes? For school and stuff?" "We could try that. And maybe Doc Patterson could teach me about medicine, like Mama was going to do." Samuel smiled at her practical approach to the problem. "I think Doc would like that." "Then I think we could make it work," she said, with the confidence of a child who'd already survived the worst the world could throw at her before. They could discuss it further. A sound from outside froze them both. Horses, moving carefully through the forest, but not carefully enough to fool ears trained by years of wilderness living. Samuel was already moving toward his rifle when Emma spoke in a whisper. "How many?" He listened intently, sorting out the sounds. 4, maybe 5. Coming from the east trail, but as he watched through the window, Samuel realized these weren't the same kind of men who'd attacked before. These riders approached openly, calling out in voices he recognized. "Samuel! It's Thompson! We're coming in!" Sheriff Thompson emerged from the tree line, followed by 4 men Samuel didn't recognize. But their bearing, their careful attention to their surroundings, and the professional way they handled their weapons told him everything he needed to know. "Looks like we're getting some help," he said to Emma, as the men rode into the clearing. Samuel could see that Thompson had been busy during his absence. The strangers wore the blue uniforms of U.S. Marshals, and they carried themselves with the confidence of men who'd faced serious trouble before. The leader, a grizzled veteran with silver hair and sharp eyes, dismounted and approached the cabin. "You Samuel Cray?" "I am. Marshal John Wesley. Sheriff Thompson tells me you've got yourself a war brewing up here." Samuel studied the marshal, noting the man's steady gaze and the casual way his hand rested near his sidearm. "Seems that way. Well, Mr. Cray, the federal government has taken an interest in this particular gang of cattle thieves. Turns out they've been operating across state lines, which makes it our jurisdiction now." Emma appeared in the doorway, still clutching the Bible Samuel had been reading from. Marshal Wesley touched his hat respectfully. "And this must be our witness. Miss Emma, I presume?" She nodded shyly, but didn't retreat into the cabin. "Well, Miss Emma, we're here to make sure those bad men never hurt anyone else. But we're going to need your help to do it." Samuel felt a surge of protectiveness. "She's been through enough. I understand your concern, Mr. Cray, but the testimony of the only witness to multiple murders is going to be crucial if we want to see justice done properly." Emma looked up at Samuel, then back at the marshal. "What kind of help do you need?" Wesley smiled, and Samuel was relieved to see genuine kindness in the man's weathered features. "Just the truth, little miss. Just the truth about what you saw." As the marshals made camp in the clearing around his cabin, Samuel realized that the solitary battle he'd been preparing to fight had transformed into something larger. The federal government was involved now, which meant resources and legal authority he couldn't provide on his own. But it also meant that Emma would be thrust back into the spotlight, forced to relive the worst night of her young life for the sake of justice. Samuel watched her helping the marshals with their gear, her small face serious with the weight of adult responsibilities, and wondered if protecting her meant keeping her safe from violence or helping her find the strength to face it. The next morning brought an unexpected discovery that would change everything Samuel thought he knew about his past and his future. Emma was helping Marshal Wesley examine her hand-drawn map when the federal lawman paused, studying Samuel with new interest. "Cray," Wesley said slowly. "Samuel Cray. That name's been bothering me since yesterday." Samuel felt a familiar chill run down his spine. He'd been careful to stay out of official records since coming to the mountains. But the past had a way of catching up to a man when he least expected it. You wouldn't happen to be the same Samuel Cray who served with the 5th Colorado Volunteer Infantry during the war. Emma looked up from her map, sensing the sudden tension in the air. Samuel set down his coffee cup carefully, his hand unconsciously moving toward the rifle that was never far from his reach. Depends on who's asking. Wesley reached into his coat, causing Samuel to tense, but the marshal only withdrew a folded piece of paper, old and yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a wanted poster with a photograph that, despite the years, was unmistakably Samuel. According to this, Wesley said quietly, Marshal Samuel Cray of the U.S. Marshal Service died in a shootout with the Barker Gang outside Pueblo in 1878. His body was recovered and buried in the town cemetery. Emma's eyes went wide. Samuel, what's he talking about? Samuel looked at the poster in Wesley's hands, his own face staring back at him from what was supposed to be his death notice. The photograph had been taken during his brief career as a federal marshal, before everything had gone wrong, before he'd been forced to choose between justice and survival. It's a long story, Samuel said finally. I've got time, Wesley replied, settling back in his chair. And frankly, I think we all need to hear it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might give him the words he needed. Finally, he began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of old sins and older regrets. After the war, I came home to find Maggie dying of fever. After she passed, I didn't much care what happened to me, so I took a job with the Marshal's Service. Figured if I was going to get myself killed, I might as well do some good in the process. Emma moved closer to him, instinctively offering the comfort of her presence. I was good at the work, Samuel continued. Maybe too good. I had a reputation for bringing in wanted men, alive when possible, dead when necessary. But there was one case that went wrong. The Barker Gang had been robbing banks across 3 states, killing anyone who got in their way. Wesley nodded. I remember the case. They killed a sheriff and 2 deputies in Cannon City, among others. Samuel's voice grew harder. I tracked them for 6 months, finally cornered them outside Pueblo. But when the shooting started, I'd realized they had a child with them, a little girl they'd taken from one of the banks they'd robbed. Emma reached for Samuel's hand, understanding instinctively what was coming next. The gang leader, Jake Barker, put a gun to that child's head and told me to drop my weapon. Said he'd kill her if I didn't back off. Samuel closed his eyes, remembering. I had a clear shot at him, could have ended it right there. But I couldn't risk the girl's life. What did you do? Wesley asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. I dropped my gun, told them I'd let them go if they released the child. Samuel opened his eyes, meeting Wesley's steady gaze. But Jake Barker wasn't the kind of man who kept his word. He shot the girl anyway, then turned the gun on me. Emma gasped, her small hand tightening around Samuel's. I dove for cover, managed to get to my backup weapon, but by then they were already riding off. The little girl was dead, and it was my fault for trusting a killer's word. Wesley leaned forward. That's not how the report read. According to the official record, you died in that shootout, Samuel smiled grimly. That was my captain's idea. He said if word got out that a federal marshal had been disarmed and left for dead by a gang of bank robbers, it would make the whole service look weak. Better to say I died heroically in the line of duty. So they faked your death, gave me a choice. I could face a board of inquiry for failing to apprehend the Barkers, or I could officially die and disappear. Start over somewhere else. Samuel gestured around his cabin. I chose to disappear. Emma had been listening with rapt attention, her young mind processing the implications. But you didn't really fail, she said finally. You tried to save that little girl. I got her killed. No, Emma said with surprising firmness. The bad men killed her. You tried to save her, just like you tried to save me. Wesley was studying Samuel with new respect. The Barker gang was wiped out 2 years later. Different marshal got them, used less honorable methods. I heard. Samuel, Wesley said carefully, officially, you're still dead. But I have the authority to reinstate federal marshals in exceptional circumstances. And these circumstances definitely qualify as exceptional. Samuel shook his head. I'm not interested in badges or authority. I just want to keep Emma safe. And that's exactly why you're the right man for the job. Wesley stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest where danger was surely gathering. This gang we're facing, they're not just cattle rustlers anymore. They've graduated to murder, kidnapping, and interstate crime. We need someone who understands them, someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to stop them. Emma tugged on Samuel's sleeve. What does it mean? If you become a marshal again? Samuel looked down at her, seeing the trust in her young eyes, trust he wasn't sure he deserved after hearing his story. It means I'd have the legal authority to hunt down the men who killed your parents. It means I could make sure they face justice instead of just disappearing into the wilderness. Would you still take care of me? Always, Samuel said without hesitation. No matter what badge I wear or don't wear, that doesn't change. Wesley reached into his coat again and withdrew a silver star, a U.S. Marshal's badge, bright and unmarked by time. Samuel Cray, by the authority vested in me by the federal government, I hereby reinstate you to active duty as a deputy U.S. Marshal. Your first assignment is to bring in the gang responsible for the murders of Thomas and Mary Brennan and the attempted murder of their daughter, Emma. Samuel stared at the badge for a long moment. It represented everything he'd tried to leave behind. The violence, the responsibility, the weight of other people's lives in his hands. But it also represented the chance to see justice done, to ensure that Emma's parents' deaths wouldn't go unpunished. There's one condition, Samuel said finally. Name it. Emma stays with me. Whatever happens, wherever this leads, she stays under my protection, Wesley smiled. Marshal Cray, I wouldn't have it any other way. As Samuel pinned the badge to his coat, Emma watched with solemn attention. She didn't fully understand all the implications of what had just happened, but she understood that the mountain man who'd saved her life was officially becoming her guardian and protector. Does this mean you're not going to be alone anymore? She asked. Samuel looked at this brave little girl who'd brought purpose back into his life and at the federal marshal who'd offered him a chance at redemption. For the first time in years, he felt like he might actually have something to live for beyond mere survival. No, little one, he said softly. I don't think I'm going to be alone anymore. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, and somewhere in the wilderness, dangerous men were planning their next move. But inside the cabin, a former marshal who'd thought his career was over had just been given a second chance, and a frightened child had just gained the legal protection of the federal government. The war was far from over. But the tide had begun to turn. The weight of the marshal's badge on Samuel's chest felt both foreign and familiar as he cleaned his custom-made rifle in the grey light of dawn. The weapon was a precision instrument, crafted by a gunsmith in Denver specifically for long-range accuracy. The tool of a man who understood that in his line of work, the difference between life and death often came down to a single, perfectly placed shot. Emma sat nearby, carefully folding strips of cloth that would serve as bandages. Marshal Wesley had taught her how to prepare medical supplies, understanding that in the coming fight, everyone would need to contribute however they could. Her small hands worked with methodical precision, and Samuel was struck by how much she'd matured in the weeks since she'd first hidden behind his coat in Cedar Ridge. Samuel, she said quietly, not looking up from her work. Are you afraid? He considered the question as he ran an oiled cloth along the rifle's barrel. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford, but honesty was something he owed this child, who'd placed her trust in him completely. I'm concerned, he said finally. Any man who says he's not worried before a fight like this is either lying or too stupid to understand the risks. But you've done this before. Different circumstances. Different stakes. Samuel set down the rifle and looked at her directly. Emma, I need you to understand something. When the fighting starts, things are going to get very dangerous very quickly. Your job, your only job, is to stay in the root cellar we prepared and not come out until either Marshal Wesley or I come to get you. She nodded solemnly, but he could see the worry in her dark eyes. What if something happens to you? Then Marshal Wesley will take care of you. And if something happens to both of us, you know the trail to town. You're strong enough and smart enough to make that journey if you have to. Emma's lower lip trembled slightly, but she straightened her shoulders with visible effort. I don't want to think about that. Neither do I, but being prepared means thinking about possibilities we don't like. Marshal Wesley entered the cabin, his weathered face grim. They're coming, he announced. My scout counted at least 15 riders, maybe more, approaching from 3 different directions. They'll be here by nightfall. Samuel felt the familiar calm that preceded combat settle over him like a well-worn coat. His breathing slowed, his senses sharpened, and his mind began calculating angles, distances, and tactical advantages. Positions, he asked. Johnson and Mitchell are in the rifle pits we dug on the north slope. Patterson and Reeves have the high ground to the south. That leaves you, me, and young Deputy Harrison to hold the cabin itself. Samuel nodded, running through the defensive plan they'd spent days perfecting. Ammunition? Enough for a sustained fight. These mountains echo gunfire for miles. If we can hold out long enough, help will come from town. And if we can't... Wesley's smile was grim but determined. Then we make sure none of these bastards live to hurt another innocent family. Throughout the day, final preparations continued with methodical efficiency. Spare rifles were positioned at strategic points around the cabin. Water buckets were filled and placed near each defensive position in case of fire. Emma's hiding place in the root cellar was stocked with food, water, and warm blankets. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Samuel found himself standing at the window where he'd first spotted Emma's attackers weeks ago. The forest looked peaceful in the golden light, but he knew that appearance was deceptive. Somewhere out there, killers were moving through the trees, drawing closer with each passing hour. Emma approached carrying a folded piece of paper. I wrote something, she said shyly. In case I don't get to say it later. Samuel took the paper and unfolded it carefully. In Emma's careful handwriting were the words, Dear Samuel, thank you for saving me and taking care of me. You are the best papa a girl could have. I love you, Emma. Samuel felt something tight constrict in his chest. He knelt down to Emma's level, looking into her serious young face. Emma, you listen to me. You're going to have plenty of chances to tell me things like this in person. This fight isn't going to end with goodbyes. It's going to end with us sitting by the fire tomorrow morning, planning what to have for breakfast. She nodded, but he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The truth was, neither was he. 15 armed men against 5 federal marshals and 1 civilian were not good odds, no matter how well they'd prepared. Samuel, Emma said quietly, can I ask you something? Always. If something bad happens, will you make sure the bad men don't hurt anyone else's family? The simple request hit Samuel harder than any bullet could have. This child, who'd lost everything to violence and cruelty, was more concerned about other potential victims than her own safety. I promise you, Emma, one way or another this ends here. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Marshal Wesley gathered his men for final instructions. Samuel listened with half his attention, while the other half remained focused on Emma, who was trying very hard to be brave, despite her obvious fear. Remember, Wesley was saying, these aren't ordinary criminals we're dealing with. They've killed federal witnesses, murdered families, and show no hesitation about targeting children. They won't surrender, and they won't retreat. This is a fight to the finish. Young Deputy Harrison, fresh-faced and eager, asked, what if they tried to negotiate, offer to trade information for safe passage? Samuel spoke for the first time during the briefing. They won't negotiate. Men like this know that if they're taken alive, they'll hang. Their only chance is to eliminate everyone who can testify against them, including the girl, Wesley added grimly. Samuel's jaw tightened. That's not going to happen. As darkness fell over the mountains, Samuel made his final rounds, checking each defensive position and ensuring his men understood their fields of fire. The custom rifle felt perfectly balanced in his hands, its familiar weight a source of comfort in the gathering gloom. Emma had already been settled in her hiding place. Though Samuel could see, it took all her courage to descend into the earthen shelter they'd prepared. Before closing the concealed entrance, he handed her his wooden cross, the same simple carving he'd given her that first day in Cedar Ridge. "Hold on to this," he said. "It'll remind you that you're not alone, even when you can't see us." She clutched the cross tightly, her small face pale but determined. "Be careful, Samuel, please." "I will. And Emma, when this is over, we're going to talk about making those adoption papers official." Her face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. "Really? Really? Now get some rest. Tomorrow, we're going to start planning our new life together." As Samuel sealed the entrance to Emma's hiding place, he offered a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening. He'd failed to protect one innocent child years ago, and that failure had haunted him ever since. Tonight, he would either redeem himself or die in the attempt. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, no whisper of wind through the pine boughs. It was the kind of absolute stillness that preceded violence, when nature itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was coming. Samuel took his position at the cabin's main window, his rifle ready, his breathing controlled. Marshal Wesley crouched near the door, his own weapon trained on the tree line where their enemies would first appear. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat, Samuel could hear horses moving carefully through the forest. The final battle was about to begin, and somewhere beneath his feet, a little girl who called him Papa was depending on him to keep the darkness at bay. The waiting was over. The war had come home. The attack came with the first grey light of dawn, announced by the sharp crack of rifle fire from the North Ridge, where Johnson and Mitchell held their position. Samuel was instantly alert, his weapon ready as muzzle flashes bloomed in the forest like deadly flowers. "Contact north," came Johnson's voice, barely audible over the gunfire. "Multiple riders, at least 8. But Samuel had already spotted movement to the south. More riders emerging from the tree line, their faces grim with deadly purpose. The gang had split their force, attacking from multiple directions just as he'd anticipated. "Wesley," Samuel called. "South approach, 6 riders." Marshal Wesley swung his rifle toward the southern threat, his first shot dropping the lead rider from his saddle. The man's horse reared and bolted, creating confusion among the others as they tried to maintain their charge across the uneven ground. Samuel's custom rifle spoke with precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. The weapon had been crafted for exactly this kind of work, accurate at distance, reliable under pressure, deadly in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities. His second shot took down another rider, while his third wounded a horse, sending its rider tumbling into the snow. From her hiding place beneath the cabin, Emma could hear the battle raging above her. The sound of gunfire was constant now, punctuated by shouting voices and the terrified screaming of wounded horses. She clutched Samuel's wooden cross tightly, the simple carved toy that had become her talisman. Of hope and safety in a world gone mad with violence, the wooden horse Samuel had carved for her. During the long winter evenings, sat beside her in the darkness, a child's toy that represented the normal life she'd lost and the new, one she hoped to build. Its simple form was a reminder that beyond this nightmare of gunfire and death, there was still room in the world for gentleness, for the kind of man who would take time to carve toys for a frightened child. Above her, Samuel worked his rifle with mechanical precision, but his heart was focused entirely on the little girl he was protecting. Every shot he fired, every position he held, every risk he took was for her, for the chance to give her a future free from fear. The gang's assault was well coordinated, but poorly executed. They had numbers, but Samuel and his men held superior positions and better training. More importantly, the federal marshals were fighting for justice and the protection of innocents, while their attackers were motivated only by the desperate need to escape the consequences of their crimes. "They're trying to flank us from the east," Deputy Harrison called out, his young voice tight with controlled fear, but steady with determination. Samuel shifted position, bringing his rifle to bear on the new threat. Through his sights, he could see 3 riders attempting to circle around behind their defensive positions. His first shot was true, dropping the lead rider cleanly from his saddle. The second shot wounded another, causing him to slump forward over his horse's neck. But even as Samuel's superior marksmanship began to thin the gang's numbers, he could see that the attackers were not retreating. These were desperate men who understood that capture meant the gallows, and they fought with the fury of the cornered and condemned. Marshal Wesley had taken a bullet in his left arm, but continued fighting, his rifle steady despite the spreading red stain on his sleeve. "Samuel! They're massing for another charge!" Samuel could see it too, the remaining gang members pulling back to regroup, their leader shouting orders that carried clearly in the cold morning air. There were still too many of them, and ammunition was beginning to run low. "Johnson! Mitchell, report!" Wesley called toward the north ridge. The response came back weak but determined. "Johnson's hit bad." "Still fighting!" Samuel made a quick calculation. They'd bloodied the gang badly, but not badly enough. The criminals still had sufficient numbers to overrun the defensive positions if they were willing to accept heavy casualties, and men facing the gallows had little to lose. "Emma's safe," Samuel told himself, speaking the words aloud as if they were a prayer. "And whatever happens up here, she's safe." The gang leader, a hard-faced man with cold eyes and a gold-toothed grin, raised his rifle and pointed it directly at the cabin where he suspected the girl was hidden. "Burn it down!" he shouted to his men. "Burn them all out!" 2 riders spurred forward, carrying burning torches they'd prepared for exactly this purpose. Samuel's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and both torchbearers tumbled from their saddles, their brands extinguished in the snow. But more men were already lighting new torches, and Samuel realized with cold certainty that the next phase of the battle would be fought not just with bullets, but with fire. Below in her hiding place, Emma heard the change in the sounds above, more shouting, different kinds of urgency in the voices. She pressed the wooden cross to her lips and whispered a prayer for the man who'd become her protector, her father in all but blood. The gentle giant who stood between her and the darkness of the world. The gang's desperate attempt to burn out the defenders was met with Samuel's most deadly accurate shooting. His custom rifle found its targets with mechanical precision, dropping torchbearers before they could reach the cabin. But Samuel knew they were running out of time and ammunition. The gang leader was rallying his remaining men for what would likely be their final, all-out assault. It was then that Emma made a decision that would change everything. Deep in her earthen hiding place, she could hear the battle intensifying above. The sounds of gunfire were constant now, mixed with the screams of wounded men and horses. But more than the sounds of combat, Emma could hear something else. The voice of Samuel calling out tactical information to his fellow marshals, the calm, steady tone of a man doing everything in his power to protect what mattered most to him. Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out the smooth river stone she'd been carrying since the day after her parents' murder. She'd found it by the creek near the ruins of her family's ranch, and it had become her testimony stone, the physical reminder of her promise to tell the truth about what she'd witnessed, no matter how frightening that truth might be. Now, listening to the men above her, risking their lives to keep her safe, Emma realized that hiding while others fought for justice was no longer enough. She had a voice, she had testimony that could end this violence forever, and she had the courage to use both. Moving carefully in the confined space, Emma made her way to the concealed entrance of her hiding place. Samuel had made her promise to stay hidden, but Samuel didn't know what she'd decided to do. Above ground, the gang leader had positioned his remaining 8 men for a final charge across the clearing. "That's where the girl is," he shouted, pointing at the cabin. "Kill everyone you find, but bring me the girl alive if possible, dead if necessary, but I want to see her body myself." Samuel heard every word and felt cold fury settle in his chest. These men would never stop hunting Emma, not until every last one of them was dead. It was time to end this permanently. "Wesley," Samuel called. "When they charge, I'm going after their leader directly." "That's suicide, Samuel. Stay in position. Their leader dies, this ends. Emma deserves better than spending the rest of her life running from these animals." Before Wesley could argue further, the gang leader raised his rifle and fired a shot that splintered the window frame inches from Samuel's head. "Time to finish this, Marshal," the man shouted. "You ready to join your wife in the ground?" Samuel's blood turned to ice. Somehow, this criminal knew about Maggie, knew about the loss that had driven Samuel into isolation. The personal nature of the taunt told Samuel everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about silencing Emma anymore. This was about revenge against the federal marshal who'd caused them so much trouble. The gang leader spurred his horse forward, his remaining men following in a desperate charge across the open ground. Samuel rose from his position, his rifle ready, prepared to meet them in the open, rather than allow the fight to reach the cabin where Emma lay hidden. But as Samuel stepped outside, he heard something that stopped him cold. "Stop." The voice was small but clear, carrying across the clearing with surprising authority. Every man in the battle, both attackers and defenders, turned toward the source of the sound. Emma stood on the cabin's front porch, no longer hiding, no longer silent. In one hand, she clutched the smooth river stone that had become her symbol of truth-telling. In the other, she held the wooden cross Samuel had carved for her. "I'm Emma Brennan," she called out, her young voice steady despite her obvious fear. "You killed my mama and papa, and you burned down our house. I saw everything you did, and I remember all of your faces." The gang leader reined in his horse, staring at this small girl who'd caused him so much trouble. His gold tooth caught the morning light as he smiled coldly. Well, the little witness finally comes out to play. I'm not afraid of you anymore," Emma continued, though Samuel could see she was trembling. "I know who you are. I know what you did. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." Samuel started toward Emma, intending to get between her and the gang leader, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I have something to say first," she announced. Then, clutching her testimony stone tightly, Emma began to speak in a clear, strong voice that carried across the clearing like a bell. "Thomas and Mary Brennan were good people who never hurt anyone. You killed them because they found out about your stolen cattle. You burned our house to hide the evidence. You tried to kill me because I was a witness. But I survived, and now everyone's going to know what kind of monsters you really are." The gang leader's face twisted with rage. "You little—" His curse was cut short by the crack of Samuel's rifle. The man tumbled from his saddle, his reign of terror ended by a single, perfectly placed shot. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader fall and faced with a child's fearless testimony, finally broke and ran. 6 months later, the courthouse in Cedar Ridge buzzed with quiet conversation as the final trial of the surviving gang members concluded. Emma sat in the front row, wearing a new blue dress that Doc Patterson's wife had sewn for her dark hair neatly braided and tied with a yellow ribbon. Beside her, Samuel wore his best shirt and the silver star of a U.S. Marshal, a badge he now carried with pride rather than reluctance. In Emma's lap lay a folder of legal documents that would change her life forever. Adoption papers, signed by a federal judge and witnessed by half the town, officially making her Emma Cray, daughter of Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel Cray. "The jury has reached a verdict," Judge Morrison announced, his weathered face grave. "On the charges of murder in the first degree, cattle rustling, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. We find the defendants guilty on all counts." Emma felt Samuel's large hand squeeze her shoulder gently as the judge continued. "The court sentences each defendant to death by hanging, sentences to be carried out within 30 days. It was over. The men who'd murdered her parents, burned her home, and hunted her through the wilderness would never hurt another family. Emma had done what she'd promised herself she would do. She'd told the truth, and justice had been served. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Samuel looked down at the little girl who'd transformed his life so completely. "How do you feel?" Emma considered the question seriously, as she did most things. Sad for Mama and Papa, but also relieved, I think. Like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder. That's exactly what it means, Samuel said. You're safe now. We both are. They walked through Cedar Ridge's main street, past Hendrick's general store, where Emma had first hidden behind Samuel's coat, past the church where Reverend Mills waved from his doorway, past Doc Patterson's office, where Emma now helped twice a week. Learning about medicine and healing, the town had embraced them both with warmth that still sometimes surprised Samuel. He'd gone from being the feared mountain hermit to being one of Cedar Ridge's most respected citizens, partly because of his federal badge, but mostly because everyone had witnessed his devotion to protecting an innocent child. Samuel, Emma said as they approached the schoolhouse where she now spent her mornings. Can we visit Mama and Papa today? Of course. They rode out to the small cemetery behind the reconstructed church where Thomas and Mary Brennan had been laid to rest. Samuel had paid for proper headstones, carved with their names and the dates of their 2 short lives. Fresh wildflowers, mountain laurel and Indian paintbrush lay on both graves, placed there by Emma during her weekly visits. Emma knelt between the graves, carefully arranging the new flowers she'd brought. Mama, Papa, she said softly, the bad men can't hurt anyone else now. Samuel and I made sure of that. She was quiet for a moment, then continued. Samuel's going to be my papa now officially and everything. I think you'd like that. He takes good care of me, and he's teaching me to be strong and brave, like you always wanted. Samuel stood a respectful distance away, letting Emma have her private conversation with her parents' memory. He'd learned that healing came in many forms, and sometimes the most important conversations were the ones held with those who could no longer answer. I miss you both so much, Emma whispered. But I'm okay. I'm really okay. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Emma turned to Samuel with a question that had clearly been on her mind. Do you think they can see me? From heaven, I mean. Samuel considered his words carefully. I think if love survives death, and I believe it does, then yes, they can see you. And I think they're proud of how brave you've been. Do you think they're proud of you, too? The question caught Samuel off guard. He looked down at this wise little girl who saw straight to the heart of things and realized she was asking about more than just her parents' approval. I hope so, he said finally. I hope they understand that loving you, protecting you, becoming your father, it's given my life more meaning than anything I've ever done. Emma slipped her small hand into his large, scarred one. Come on, Papa, let's go home. Papa! The words still sent a warm shock through Samuel's chest every time she said it. He'd never expected to be anyone's father, had thought that chance had passed him by when Maggie died, but life had surprised him with this fierce, brave little girl who'd brought light back into his darkness as they rode back toward their cabin, now expanded with an additional room for Emma and proper furnishings. Donated by half the town, Samuel reflected on how much had changed. The solitary mountain man was gone, replaced by a federal marshal with a family to protect and a community that counted on him. Emma chattered happily about her plans for the week, school lessons with the new teacher, helping Doc Patterson with his patients, working on the garden she'd planted behind their cabin. Her life was full of normal childhood activities now, the kind of routine happiness that made the violence of the past seem like a distant nightmare. Samuel, she said, as their cabin came into view, I love our life. So do I, little one. So do I. That evening, as they sat by the fire reading together, Emma looked up from her book with the serious expression she wore when something important was on her mind. Samuel, I want you to know something. What's that? You saved me. Not just from the bad men, but from being alone and scared forever. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to be happy again. Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Emma, you saved me too. You brought me back to the world when I thought I was done living in it. She smiled then, the bright, unguarded smile of a child who felt completely safe and loved. I guess we saved each other. Outside their cabin, snow began to fall gently on the mountain peaks. But inside, a father and daughter sat warm by the fire, reading stories and planning for a future filled with hope. The scared little girl who had once run and hidden behind a mountain man was gone, replaced by a confident young woman who knew she was loved and protected, and the mountain man himself had been transformed as well, from a lonely hermit into a father, a protector, and a man who'd found his purpose in the love of a child who'd needed him as much as he'd needed her.